So, good afternoon, everybody. We'll continue our lectures here on population society, and today we start the chapter about internal migration. I just wanted to show you something fun here. Today, the classroom has no students, just me. It's just cool, new experience for me. I posted the grades for assignment 1 in Canvas, and the assignment 1 had pretty much two portions. One portion that was related to consequences of population growth, and the other one about other concerns that demographers have about population distribution, population composition, and also theories of demography. And that assignment was worth 3 points. So nobody got less than 1 point. Everybody who submitted got at least 1 point. But there were some variations between 1, 2, and 3, depending on how well people used strong arguments or good arguments based on the discussion from the classroom to support the first question, which is about population growth, and whether they also develop the second portion of the assignment. So just be careful in the next assignment to answer all the questions that are asked. And it's not about opinion. You have to base your answer on discussions that we have been having in the classroom and also in the textbook and all the course materials. So it has to be based more in scientific discussion. I will just, before I start the class on internal migration, I just updated here in the syllabus that, so the first assignment that we have was worth 3 points, and it was about, like I just said, population growth, distribution, composition, theories of demography. The assignment 2 now is going to be about fertility and mortality. And the assignment 3 is going to be about migration. And I increased the number of points for assignment 3. So all assignments 1, 2, and 3 are worth 3 points each. And we're going to have 17 quizzes until the end of the semester. So we will have a total of 26 points coming from quizzes and assignments. So throughout the semester, a total of 6 extra credit points, okay, instead of only 5 as I had before, because pretty much here 2 extra credit points for each one of the 3 assignments. If you go to the course website, just go to the course website and scroll down here, and you have here the link to the assignment 2. So there are instructions about this assignment already there. And so if you click there, you're going to see assignment 2. If you go to Canvas after 4:30 p.m. today, you also have the direct link in which you have access to the same file, which can be also accessed right now on the course website. And just the assignment 2, let me just get the file from here, it's easier to show. So the assignment 2 is going to be about fertility and mortality. And these assignments I try to make you have more in-depth, substantive, critical discussion about the topic that I'm asking. So the idea is that it's not just subjective as the multiple choice questions. In this specific class here, the idea of the assignment is to discuss the effects of the coronavirus pandemic on fertility and mortality levels and trends in these next few years. Students should use scientific theoretical framework discussed in the classroom to support the analysis and not rely on preconceptions and perceptions we might have about specific demographic subjects. And so the basic question, what do you expect will be the effect of the coronavirus pandemic on fertility and mortality trends and levels in the next years? not about your opinion. It's about based on the theoretical discussions that we had in the classroom and previous trends of fertility and mortality. How do you expect that the current pandemic might affect them? So I'm specific here about fertility. We should utilize the framework of predicting fertility and proximate determinants of fertility to support your analysis. And more specific, the discussion by John Bongartz. You can discuss effects of the pandemic on different fertility indicators, such as age-specific fertility rates and total fertility rate. After I finish the chapter about fertility, I think I was one day that I was starting the lecture about mortality, I kind of went back into the fertility slides and discussed how we expect the pandemic to affect fertility levels based on previous knowledge that we have. The lights just turned off here. So if you just go back to our first fertility lectures, so it's pretty much this part here. Just get specific, this slide where I discussed that, yeah. So on the fertility slide, slide 31, John Bongartz emphasizes that the first 4 proximate determinants of fertility listed here in this box are the major effects on fertility: proportional marriage, contraception, induced abortion, and postpartum fecundability. And these 4 indicators are the ones that I discussed over here as well. So we are having these major effects because of the pandemic, and the pandemic affects socioeconomic outcomes of the society, increases in unemployment, how these major changes in our society affect these proximate determinants of fertility. So if you go back to my recorded lectures, you're going to see my answer there based on this theoretical discussion provided by Bongartz, okay? And for the mortality chapter, I also did the same thing. The mortality chapter, when I was talking about, wasn't the example of the Eastern Europe. This is an example from the textbook. And in the textbook, it was published in 2017, so pre-pandemic. They're discussing here the increasing mortality trends in Eastern Europe, but and saying that they are these major issues that the society is passing through that affect these other factors here that are more proximate into the chances of increasing mortality. So I discussed in that lecture that these ones here would be more the contextual factors that influence what this would be, making an analogy to fertility. This would be here, in this example, the proximate determinants of mortality, in this example of Eastern Europe, and then they affect mortality, right? So that's the kind of discussion that I'm expecting you guys to do. The pandemic, increasing unemployment, making people lose jobs and so on. That has an effect on health, how that will affect specific indicators that then will influence mortality of the population. And of course, the pandemic itself has a huge effect on like many people dying because of the pandemic. So the death effect is right there as well. So it's not just mortality, but also morbidity. So all that discussion you can do in order to answer these questions here. So, and specific about the mortality, I mentioned, you should also discuss possible effects of the pandemic on life expectancy, including contextual and broader socioeconomic and cultural effects, as well as more immediate factors. So this is exactly what I showed in the example for Eastern Europe. Contextual and broader socioeconomic cultural factors influencing more immediate factors that then influence mortality. The So it's pretty much you trying to link all these different discussions that we have been doing throughout the semester. So that's the assignment. And the assignment is due only on Tuesday. So you have there few days to answer. On Tuesday, the deadline for this assignment is at noon. And the same way, a maximum possible points equals to 3. So it's the regular 1 point plus 2 extra points. And on Tuesday as well, as you remember, we will have exam 3. So this second assignment is due at noon. And exam 3 will open on Canvas on Tuesday from 1 p.m. until 8 p.m. as we have done for exams 1 and 2. So exam 3 is going to cover not exactly what's listed here because of the winter storm, we had some delays, but pretty much exam 2, I did ask some questions about the fertility chapter. I did ask questions on exam 2 about the concepts and measurement of fertility. Now exam 3, I will include the whole fertility chapter. So it will again include questions about concepts and measurement of fertility, but it will include questions about all these other topics here. So exam 3, you include the whole fertility chapter that we discussed in the classroom and have the course website material and also the textbook. It will also include the whole mortality chapter. So fertility chapter, the whole fertility chapter, the whole mortality chapter, and whatever topics on internal migration that we cover until the end of the class today. Okay? So these are major announcements that I have to make. Assignment 2 available. Be careful to answer all the questions that I'm asking here. In this case, fertility and mortality. Use arguments based on science, based on discussions that we had in the classroom. It's due at noon on Tuesday. At 1 p.m., exam 3 opens, and it will close at 8 p.m., but it's the same way as before. Once you start it, you have 1 hour and 15 minutes to finish, the same way that we did for exams 1 and 2. And again, exam 3 will cover the whole fertility chapter, the whole mortality chapter, and whatever portion of the internal migration chapter that we cover today. And just try to move here a little bit. I think that, yeah. So now it's the lights just turned off because there was no movement here. Okay. Any questions about the assignment 2? Any questions about the grade on assignment 1? So people who didn't get the 3 points on assignment 1 is because there was some lack of arguments to the first major question about population growth, or because they did not answer the second set of questions about population distribution, composition, and theories of demography, right? No questions? All good? Let's see here. So let me just start the migration chapter. I don't think I forgot anything. So the syllabus, I included an extra point, assignment 1 and 2, all good. And I can't see the chat here, so if you have any question, you can write in the chat today. This is the major topics that we're going to talk in this chapter about internal migration. And for both the internal and international migration, I add more information into the lectures than what's available in the textbook, right? So there is more information in the lecture, so you should have to be careful to study both the textbook and the material available in the lecture as well. So here, I'm going to give you an introduction to migration, discuss main concepts and definitions of migration, measures of migration, some examples of indicators, some migration rates, and then give some examples about trends of domestic migration in the US, in other words, internal migration in the US. And I will also give you some examples about internal migration in the US based on a study that I am conducting using census data and using the American Community Survey. These slides here about internal migration in China, they are part of the textbook and also here in my lecture, but I will not cover them. So this is considered extra material. I will not cover them. I will not ask questions about internal migration in China in the exams or quizzes, okay? So just starting then, besides fertility and mortality, the third way the populations can change their size is through migration, not only size, but also composition and distribution, of course. In the case of migration, the population, the size of population decreases in the area of origin, that it's losing people, and increases in the area of destination, that is receiving people. Unlike mortality and fertility, migration may happen on multiple occasions or never occur during our lifetime. Of course, mortality happens once for everybody. Fertility also might happen more than once or might never happen as well. So this discussion here in the textbook is a little bit misleading because fertility also, we have been seeing the increasing women and men as well not having children at all, or having several children, which is actually common. So migration in that case is more similar to fertility than to mortality in terms of the incidence. But migration, the idea is that it can move much more. You can move 10, 15 times in your life. And that's usually less likely in our contemporary society to have people having so many children as the moves that they have. If you think about internal migration between states or between countries, for example, might have moved between like around 10 times. And that's a number much higher than the number of children that I have. And that's just an example, and that applies to the overall society as well. Okay? And I'd like to go back to the classics, to demographers and researchers that dealt with the issue of internal migration several decades ago, just to show that these discussions that were done several decades ago, they are still being used in current studies about migration. Migration is defined broadly as a permanent or semi-permanent change of residence. No restriction is placed upon the distance of the move or upon the voluntary or involuntary nature of the act. And just open a parenthesis here. For the US, internal migration, as defined by the Census Bureau, are people who move their permanent residence from one county to the other. If they move from one house to the other within the same county, according to the Census Bureau, these people are not internal migrants in the US. So this definition here of LEA is not actually used by the Census Bureau. But for example, I'm doing now a project about internal migration, international migration in the US using restricted data. And what is this restricted data? This is data that the Census Bureau doesn't make it available for the public. You have to write a project and you have to go to specific data centers to analyze that data. there are around 25, 30 of those restricted data centers in the US from the Census Bureau. And one of them is here at Texas A&M University, which is the so-called the Texas Research Data Center, the TXRDC. In that center, these restricted data, they give information not just about where the person lived 1 year ago or the county that the person lived exactly 1 year ago, but you might have information for some years also about the block group level where the person lived 1 year ago within the county. In that case, I can explore other levels of geography to understand internal migration in the US, even migrations within the same county. Oh, but I just said that the Census Bureau doesn't think that migration within the same county is considered internal migration. But I can still use it to maybe analyze mobility, maybe people moving to more wealthy areas within the county. And it might give us some information about mobility within counties. And with the idea of Lee that the distance, whether people are moving farther away or really close to where they were living before, doesn't matter. If you are moving to another residence and moving everything with your family, your belongings, you are a migrant. But again, the formal definition of internal migrant based on the Census Bureau definition is people who move from one county to the other, not within counties. And this discussion here is that there is no distinction made between external and internal migrants. So people who move within countries or move between countries, they're all migrants, right? We can analyze only internal migrants and we can analyze only international migrants, but they're all migrants, right? I mean, of course, we usually tend to concentrate our study in specific areas, but they are all migrants. Every act of migration involves an origin, a destination, and a set of intervening obstacles. And distance is the main intervening obstacle. Usually, if you live farther away from a specific area, your chances to move to that area will be lower than moving to a more close by area. Okay? So migration is the permanent change of residence, and it's a sign of residential mobility. Maybe people that are moving to bigger cities or moving to specific locations, they got better jobs, so it might be related to mobility in terms of socioeconomic status of people. Moving a great enough distance that all activities are transferred from one place to the other. If I live in Houston and I come to College Station just to work and I go back to Houston, that's not migration. I'm just commuting. If I live in Austin and I come to College Station to teach, that's not migration because I'm not transferring all my residents to College Station. I'm just commuting, right? So that's an important distinction too. International migrants move between countries and internal migrants move within countries. We usually hear a lot about internal migrants, the distinction between legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants, those that enter a specific country without a visa or if they might enter a specific country with a tourist visa or another temporary visa, but they overstay their visas. That's usually most of the origin of undocumented immigrants in the US nowadays. They overstay their visas. And we're going to talk about that in the next chapter about international migration. And internal migration for us in the US, we actually don't think about the possibility of having constraints. Here in the US, we are pretty much kind of free to decide to move to other states, other cities. Of course, we depend on job availability in other places, if I have family in other places that are more likely to attract me to those places, friends, and so on. But in some countries, and that's the discussion that's done about internal migration in China that I will not cover in detail, some countries might have some regulations for you to don't move within the country. So in China, for example, people who live in rural areas, they need the permission of the government in China to be able to move to urban areas. Or what about if they don't have this permit and they still move from rural to urban areas? Then they will not have access to any public services. Their family, their children will not have access to public school. They will not be able to work in the formal job market. And these people will have to work in the informal job market that usually have lower paying jobs. And they will not have access to health services. But even with all these issues, some people still move from rural to several millions of people move from rural to urban areas in China, even without the permission of the government, because their lives will be better in the urban areas, even if they compare if they stay back in the rural areas. And in some cases, what happens is that just the men or adults, they move from rural to urban areas and the children stay back behind in the rural areas, and these people send money back to them. Exactly because children would not have access to education if they move without the permission of their parent, if the government didn't allow their parents to move. So some of these parents, they move without their children, and that also creates some disruptions in families and households. So this permission in terms of internal migration, we don't actually have this here implemented in the US, but other countries have that kind of regulations, or might have that kind of regulation. Whenever you're trying to measure migration, it's good to think about permanence. Permanence usually means that you have been gone at least 1 year from the previous place. So if I I'm in College Station and during the summer, I want to do some research in Brazil, and I go to Brazil and spend 3 months in Brazil during the summer doing some research, that's not considered migration. If I stay there for at least 1 year, then I would be considered a migrant from the US to Brazil. The distance moved in the US. Oh, and in this case here also applies to internal migration. If I want to do a sabbatical and I move from College Station to DC for 1 semester, I'm not considered an internal migrant because I just went there for 1 semester and came back. But if I at least stay there for 1 year, then I'm considered an internal migrant from Texas to DC, for example. And the distance moved in the US. The Census Bureau defines an internal migrant as a person who moved to a different county within the US. So that's a discussion that I did before. If you move within a county in the US, based on this definition from the Census Bureau, you are not an internal migrant. But in some cases, it might be interesting to analyze migration within counties. For example, if some policymakers want to understand the demand of students for specific school districts. So from the standpoint of a local school district, a migrant would be someone moving into or out of the school district's boundaries. So the same county might have different school districts. And if I move from one residence to the other and I cross a school district line, my children will have to go to another school. And for policymakers, that's important because then they will have to know if specific schools, because of internal migration within that county, for example, are receiving more people and then more children that will have to attend those schools. So even migration within counties might be important to analyze, as well as I also mentioned in my research project at the TXRDC. And we talked about mortality transition and fertility transition within that framework of demographic transition theory. Countries had really high mortality and really high fertility. And then you start to see some improvements in health. Countries start to see a decline in mortality, and then afterwards a decline in fertility. So this is the process of demographic transition theory, and it's more centered on discussions about changes or decreases in the rates of mortality and fertility. The case of migration is migration, again, talking about people moving from one place to the other, usually in response to resource scarcity in the area of origin, typically caused by having too many people in that area relative to the perceived resources in the destination area. In the migration transition, specifically, when we are talking about internal migration transition, is related to the urbanization process. People moving from rural areas to urban areas. And that's because the rural areas overall have fewer people than in urban areas, but the size of the population relative to the resources in that area will make people want to leave the rural areas into the destination areas. And one thing that we discussed in the chapter about theories of demography, in the specific case of theories of internal migration, some people might keep moving from rural to urban areas, even though in the urban areas they might not get a better job. They might not get a better life. But if those people have the perceived idea that they will have better resources in the destination area, they will keep moving. And that's based on theory that Todaro, an economist, discussed since the 70s. So it's pretty much people will keep moving from rural to urban areas, even if in urban areas they won't have a better life than before. But I have this idea based on limited information that I have that I would have a better job in the destination. So it is closely related to the urban transition because most migrants are moving from rural to urban areas, no matter where they are from. And whenever we are talking about migration, it's good to know about the difference between flow and stock. Migration transition involves a process and a transformation. The migration flow is related to this process of people moving from one place to another within a specific period. So people moving from one place to another within a specific time interval. So for example, the American Community Survey asks people, where did you live exactly 1 year ago? So the American Community Survey in the US allows us to measure this migration flow from 1 year to the other. So if I'm using data from the 2019 American Community Survey, that's the latest one available. And I analyze the question about people where they live 1 year ago, where they live in 2018. I'm analyzing the migration flow, people moving from 2018 to 2019 in another area. So they're moving from one area to the other between 2018 and 2019. So there's a process of people moving in this specific time period. But let's say that a lot of people are moving within the US for several years, for several decades. After this process of people moving from one area to the other within the US, what's the final transformation that the migration causes? And that's related to the migration stock. is the transformation caused in areas of origin and destination as people move into and out of given areas. Amount of migrants in areas of origin and destination at specific times after we have the migration flows. So after several years of migration flows, of this process of people moving from one area to the other, how the country looks like in terms of areas that lost more people and areas that are receiving more people. And then we analyze the final result, the final transformation, the stock of migration. How many people left one place throughout this whole period of time, and people who got into this other area. And as we were talking about those frameworks to try to explain fertility and mortality, we also have different frameworks trying to understand the reasons of why people migrate. So there are different factors that influence the propensity to migrate. It can be individual factors, household factors, or more community, contextual factors. So my level of education, my level of training skills, all those human capital variables will make me more likely to maybe want to move to another area that I will have better job opportunities. And whether I'm okay about taking the risk of moving to these other areas. So usually more related to individual characteristics. But also, if I'm a child and I live in the household where my parents are living, or if I get married and my spouse lives in another place, so I might move to where she lives. So there are also household, family factors that influence the migration of people. And if specific communities are experiencing loss of jobs and experiencing some economic issues, people might start to get out of those areas. And if they don't have good universities or good schools, with job opportunities, people might start to move away. And this propensity, these different factors, individual, household, and community factors that influence the propensity to migrate, they are these general factors, as we had, making an analogy to the framework of proximate determinants of fertility from Baumgart's. This would be more the general factors that influence these other factors here that has actually the real motivation to migrate. What are the benefits of migrating? What are the costs or constraints of migrating? The benefits and costs of migrating are related to these more general topics that can be individual, household, or community level variables. Based on my analysis for each one of the individuals and households about the benefits and costs of migration, people will finally decide to migrate with specific intentions, right? Whether usually trying to get better job opportunities, better life conditions, okay? And here, these authors, they, like Martin Bell, he retired, he was a professor in Australia, and he has like this really big group of people that collected information about internal migration flows and rates and stock in several different countries. And I really like his papers because he kind of also provide a theoretical approach to migration in the same way that Baumgart's did for fertility. So in this diagram here, he's exactly thinking about some proximate determinants of migration age profiles. What are these major contextual factors, social, economic, demographic, cultural, religious factors that influence some other variables that are closer to my decision to migrate to another place? And these decisions vary by age. Usually people between 25, 35 years of age are the ones that are most likely to migrate. what would be the proximate determinants of migration? You guys know, probably many of you moved from your hometown into a college station because you are coming to college. So that's really common in the US. People move out from their parents' house and move to another city in order to attend college. That's not common in other countries. I mean, for example, Brazil and all the Latin American countries, if you go to college, you tend to go to college in the same city where your parents live, and you stay at home even when you are in college, right? But here in the US, that's really clear. When you enter higher education, university, you tend to move to another area. When you finish, when you graduate, you also tend to move to another city. So you graduate from college, you tend to have a higher chance to move to another area, maybe back to where your parents live, maybe to another city, right? It's not 100% chance. You could still get a job in College Station and stay here afterwards, but there is a higher probability of migrating to another area when you finish university education. When you first get a job, when you enter the labor force, you also have a higher chance of moving to other areas. And then when you start to have a more stabilized life and you get married and you have children, then your chances of migrating decrease. As you get married, as you have children, the chances of migrating decline. And if you get divorced, you actually might have some incentive to move to another place. When your children go to attend the university, they will move to another place, as we talk up here, but also that might make you more likely to decide to move to another city as well, now that you might not want to live in that area where you were living with your children. And if you retire and you want to live in a place that has a better weather, that you want to enjoy in your last decades of life, you might also be more likely to migrate to another area within the country. So all these different factors, these life course transitions here, they are influenced by these major aggregate level contextual factors. And then they influence the decision of migrating. And as I said, these chances of migrating, they vary by age. Each one of those here are related to specific ages of individuals throughout their life course. And I'm going to show one slide exactly by the same authors that will show the migration rates by age, in which they kind of show these proximate determinants, these life course transitions related to migration. So internal migration is a geographical move resulting in a change of residence that crosses a political or jurisdictional boundary, usually a county-type geographical unit in a country. And that's the formal definition of the Census Bureau in the US, moves between counties. Over time, internal migration is a story of rural population growth leading to a redundancy of that population, so people to look for jobs and life elsewhere. So even if rural areas, I mentioned before, might have smaller population as a whole than urban areas, relative to the job opportunities that I might have in rural areas, that population in rural areas is too big relative to the job opportunities and to the life conditions that I might have there. So that will make me move to other areas, move to an urban area, that I at least have the expectation to have a better life over there. When the population is almost entirely urban, as is in the case in the US and Western Europe, people start to move between urban places. And we might call this process migration evolution. So you start to see, like the US is a really clear case. I mean, there is always a discussion in the US that some areas are underdeveloped. I mean, we have seen some major economic issues and loss of jobs in these last decades in Midwestern states, and a lot of people left those states. But overall, the US has all these different cities with really well-developed conditions in terms of their job opportunities and so on, that attract people within the US from all these different places. In other words, economic development in the US is actually really decentralized compared to other countries. Most of, for example, the Argentinian industry and production is so concentrated in Buenos Aires, in the capital. A lot of the economy and production in Brazil is concentrated in southeastern states, São Paulo, Rio, and another state called Minas Gerais. And also really concentrated across the coast, the East Coast. And several other areas in these other developed countries are not developed, so they don't attract as many migrants. So usually in those countries, we still see a lot of rural-urban migration. But even those countries and the US and Western Europe, what happens now are people migrating from urban to urban places, even people deciding to get out from a big city and move to a mid-sized city, which has the same job opportunities and a better life quality. And that's what in the textbook is discussed being a migration evolution. Okay, then we start to see not just migration from rural to urban areas, but migration within urban areas. And related to the discussion that I had here before about if you are moving within counties or between counties. This is related to the distinction between a mover and a migrant. Any person who changes his or her residence is a mover. Not all movers are migrants, because a person can move within the same community without involving the crossing of a political boundary. All migrants are movers because the residential movement of migrant involves the move of at least moving from one county to the other. So, the example, in the Census Bureau definition, if someone moves from one house to the other within a county, that person is a mover, but not a migrant. If one person moves from one county to another county, that person is a migrant and a mover, right? So all migrants are movers, but not all movers are migrants, exactly because whether they're moving within counties or not. And the Census Bureau demographers have estimated that a person in the United States may move around 12 times in one's lifetime. So this is related to that first slide that I mentioned to you guys here, that migration is a little different than mortality and fertility. Mortality, we die once, everybody. Fertility, some people might decide to don't have children at all, and some people have many children. But overall, in more developed countries, the level of total fertility rate is around 2 children per woman. Internal migration happens much more often, on average, considering internal migration in the US, for example, 12 times in someone's life. And there are some consequences of migration on our society. Migration impacts receiving and sending areas. The areas of origin, those ones that are losing migrants, they usually lose young adults, which can slow down population growth in those areas. As I'm going to show you here with some graphs about migration rates by age. Usually, people who have higher chances of migrating are people between 25 and 35 years of age. So the areas losing internal migrants, they will have fewer people in reproductive ages, fewer young adults. So that can have a negative effect on population growth. And the destination areas, the host areas, you gain these young adults, which might increase population growth and increase the proportion of the youth population in those areas. When we are talking about remittances, migrants sending money back to the areas of origin, that's not just important when we're talking about international migration of people coming to the US and sending money back to their family members who stayed back in their home country. Remittances, the example of China, is also important for internal migration. Maybe adult family members move from rural to urban areas without the government permission, but then they send money back to those other family members who stayed behind. Right? So remittances from migrants back to sending communities have become important to economies of those places. Right? So that's the first part. And I will just keep going here on some major concepts and definitions about migration, just going a little bit more in depth on these differentiations. So migration is a permanent residential move, either local or jurisdictional, and is usually defined as a change in residence less than at least a year of duration. The residential migration of persons moving to an area of destination is called in-migration. And migration of persons leaving an area of origin are known as being out-migrants. So that's the out-migration. If I moved from LA to College Station, I'm an out-migrant from Los Angeles, and I'm an in-migrant in College Station. And if I go back to LA after some years, I'm a return migration. I'm a return migrant in LA. So return migration, is it possible that a migrant might move back to the area of origin, right? That's also typical for international migration as well. Some people might move from Latin America to the US, for example, and when they get older, they might want back to move to their home country. But the terms for internal migration are, if I'm looking at the point of view of the destination area, I'm doing an analysis of in-migration. If I'm looking at the point of view of the sending areas, I'm doing an analysis of out-migration. And this is just to summarize. I think I showed you this table before. These different terms is important because usually people get confused about them. If I'm talking about internal migration, which is the topic of this chapter here, migration within countries. If I'm looking at the point of view of the effects in the destination areas, I'm doing analysis of in-migration. And I'm trying to understand the effects of people getting out of some areas within a country to others. And I want to see the effects in the areas of origin. I'm doing analysis of out-migration. And if I'm doing analysis about migration between countries, international migration, and I'm here in the US looking at the effects of migration from Latin America to the US, I'm doing analysis of immigration. Or if I'm in Latin America and I want to understand how losing so many young adults to the US might affect the economy in the countries of origin, I'm doing an analysis of the effects of immigration. Okay? And here, just start to show you some measures of how we can analyze the overall trends and level of migration. One of them is the net migration. When you subtract the number of out migrants from the number of in-migrants of a given geographical area, we get net migration. So net migration is the overall number of in-migrants that a specific area received, minus the overall number of out migrants that that specific area lost. And the net balance could be positive, negative, or zero. More people entering, net migration positive. More people leaving, negative. Similar number of people entering or leaving, zero net migration. When we add, so in some cases, I'm looking, let's say I'm doing analysis about specific states, and those states might actually be receiving a lot of people from other states, but at the same time, they could be losing a lot of people to other states. Because they might be a really dynamic place and they are receiving and losing people all the time. So if I do analysis about net migration for that specific case, in this hypothetical example here that I'm having, I'm not even naming any specific place. If I estimate net migration, I might get a result close to zero because these people receive, but they also lose a lot of people. And the net migration, that specific case might give me the wrong impression that migration is not important for that area. But it is. There is a lot of in and out migration. To show how dynamic that area is in terms of people moving in and moving out, in that specific example, the indicator of gross migration would be more appropriate. I would get the overall number of in migrants, the overall number of out migrants, and add them. And I would kind of see that the overall number of people moving in and moving out is high compared to the overall size of that specific area. I could divide that by the population of that area. Migration efficiency is another indicator that we can estimate as well. When we divide an area's net migration by gross migration, so it's pretty much dividing net migration by gross migration, we get migration efficiency. We say migration is positively efficient for an area when there has been a lot of in-migrants relative to little out-migration. Negatively efficient, a lot of people getting out compared to not as many people moving in. When the numbers of in-migrant and out-migrants are about the same, we say that migration efficiency for that area becomes inefficient. So the sign of being positive, negative, or zero is actually driven by net migration. Because here we can have positive or negative signs. And divided by gross migration, you're just dividing by the overall number of people moving in and moving out. But as I said before, instead of dividing net migration to gross migration, which is important because we can estimate migration efficiency, we can also divide net migration by the population of that area and gross migration by the population of that area to get rates as well. Migration stream is a group of migrants having a common area of origin and a common area of destination during a specific migration interval. So there are a lot of migration now towards southern states in the US, or more specifically to Texas. Texas has been receiving a lot of internal migrants, of course, within the US compared to the numbers of people getting out of Texas. When you have these major streams, both of internal and international migration, you also have a migration counter stream. The counter streams tend to be smaller in size, and it's pretty much people going the opposite direction. Right? So maybe people going from Texas to Midwestern states, for example. But this stream and counter stream, they are really related to each other exactly because people moving from one area to the other, even within a country, they keep ties to the previous area of origin. And then maybe future generations might decide to go back to that area of origin. That happens, for example, a lot with the African American population. When we're going to talk about the Great Migration in the US, a lot of African Americans moved from southern states to the Northeast in the US in the 1930s. And in more recent years, you start to see the opposite migration, people moving back to, African Americans moving back to southern states. So that's pretty much an example of a real stream and counter stream of internal migration in the US. Migration interval is a temporal dimension of migration defined by the researcher. It's a time between two events, namely the time of arriving at the area of destination and the time of departing the area of origin. The American Community Survey in the US asks where exactly the person lived 1 year ago. So that's the time frame. Up to the 2000 census, we had also the question about migration in the census, in the decennial census. And in the decennial census, it was asked to the people where they lived exactly 5 years ago. In the American Community Survey, we asked 1 year ago. And starting the 2010 census, the question about migration is not asked anymore. So now we have that information only 1 year ago from the American Community Survey. The Census Bureau also used data from income tax, so data from the Internal Revenue Service, to estimate migration, because when we file our income tax, we put our name and the Social Security number and everything, or tax identification number. And if we do that every year, and we use that data, we can track people where they live. So we can also measure migration, internal migration, with data from the IRS. And the migration interval is also every year, 1 year to the other, from April to April, right? Usually people that file tax late, and because of the pandemic, there were some changes, but usually April 15, okay? We also try to understand variation in migration according to several characteristics of people and several characteristics of populations. Populations that have a higher proportion of people in younger groups. So due to demographic composition, those places might be more likely to have out-migrants. Social and economic characteristics, places that have been facing issues of employment, inflation, or sociological problems, or poverty, or violence. Those areas might have people deciding to get out of those places. So migration varies a lot according to a series of characteristics of the populations of origin and destination. And we talked already in the chapter about theories of migration, about the push and pull factors. The push factors are the characteristics of areas of origin that make people want to get out of those areas. The pull factors are the factors of the areas of destination that make people want to move to those areas, right? But the migration process is also selective. Not everyone has the same chances of staying, and not everyone has the same chances of migrating. And that's, for example, related to the discussion that we had in the mortality chapter about the Hispanic health paradox or the Latino health paradox. That maybe people that move from Latin American countries, or more specifically from Mexico to the US, are the healthier ones, are the ones that have better mental and physical health, and then they are more likely to migrate to the US. So there isn't a selection to migrate to a specific country based on my health conditions. If I'm healthy, I'll be more likely to migrate. But also, it can be related to a series of other socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. My age, my race, ethnicity, my sex, my socioeconomic status. Age and education are strong predictors of migration. Americans aged between 18 and 24 are more likely to move due to events such as entering in college or getting their first job. So when people in the US, they reach 18 years of age, they're more likely to leave the cities where they were raised with their parents, move to other places where they're going to get higher education. And after they graduate, they might get a job in another city and then move again. And exactly what I mentioned before, this selectivity is influenced by push and pull factors, characteristics of the areas of destination and characteristics of the areas of origin. Migrants tend to be positively selected when they are responding to positive pull factors in the area of destination. So if I have a specific area in the country that has a lot of economic growth, high employment rate, those positive factors that would make people have better life conditions will usually attract migrants with better educational attainment, with better health, and usually with also better job skills. So that's why we say that migrants are positively selected by these socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. Migrants, on the other hand, tend to be negatively selected when they are responding to negative factors in the area of origin. So if I have an area within a country that is experiencing economic stagnation, not many job opportunities, not many opportunities for people to grow financially, for example, these migrants will tend to get out of these areas. But these people that will tend to get out of these areas that are experiencing these negative factors, such as economic stagnation, they are less likely to have higher socioeconomic status than those responding to pull factors. Exactly because of that, these specific migrants moving from areas that are experiencing a series of issues, they tend to be more negatively selected in terms of socioeconomic characteristics. Okay? And this is the graph. I could even have put this graph back after that diagram that the same authors have discussed. When I discussed, let's just go back there to the diagram. This diagram here, in which I talked about the proximate determinants of migration. I have these contextual factors, social, economic, demographic, cultural, and religious factors that shape our society, and they will influence the age or the chances that I have to enter in college or get a job or get married, have children, and so on. And all these life course transitions, they vary by age and they influence migration. And the graph exactly related to this framework to give a picture to this framework is that one. Is exactly this one here. This is a more like a hypothetical example, but several countries follow the shape of migration rates by age. So here, there is a measure of migration intensity, usually migration rate. Usually children have lower chances of migrating. And as we get older and then we reach 18 years of age, we enter college and our chances of migrating increases. And then when I finish college and I get another job, I enter the labor force, my chances of migrating increase as well. And then as I get married, my chances of staying in the same place start to increase. So my migration intensity declines. Have children, I have a change of job, but I tend to stay in the same place. The children leave home. I could maybe see an increase in migration here, but I tend to decline as well. But when I retire, I have a higher chance to decide to migrate to another place. So you might see some increases in migration rates around retirement ages in specific countries, or even within countries. And as I get into even older ages and I have to move to some institutions to help, to have more intensive care for the elderly population, then you start to see increases in migration as well. So you remember the overall shape of fertility rates by age, the so-called age-specific fertility rates. The age-specific fertility rates, you remember, it's pretty much an inverted U-curve, right? Women between 25 and 30 years of age have higher chances of having children. What about the mortality rates by age that we use in the life tables? We see higher chance of dying of people who are just born before they complete 1 year of age, but then it declines. Oh, let's start from here. It declines, and then afterwards starts to increase again the chance of dying as I get older. So those were the typical fertility rates by age and the mortality rates by age. And these are the typical migration rates by age. It's a little bit more difficult to model if you want to do a mathematical model, because you have first this decline and then this parabola, and in some cases another parabola and another increase. And one interesting thing about this is that usually the chances of children to migrate mirror the chances of their parents to migrate. So usually the rates of these children here below 15 years of age are similar to the rates of these people here who are their parents. Okay, and then actually we can compare the rates of this group here to the rates of this group to see if parents are moving with or without their children. And here, real data, same authors, and for China, Portugal, and Brazil. Let's start with Portugal. We see children kind of like having rates that are kind of like similar to their parents, these guys here, having rates that kind of follow a little bit the rates of these guys. And then it declines, but then starts to increase as these people enter university and then get a job and then start to have more stable family, chances decline. And as they get older, maybe related to retirement or moving to institutions, the chances of migrating increase. For Brazil, the rates of children here also kind of like a little bit more similar to their parents, but there's not that much variation by age as you saw in Portugal. In Portugal, there's a lot of variation here. Increase and increase. In Brazil, it's a little bit more subtle. kind of showing that, okay, there are variation by age in terms of migration intensity, but it doesn't vary so much as in other countries. And then in China, the variation is even greater if we look at different ages. Really high chances of migrating around 18 years of age. Usually because Chinese people, they migrate when they are entering their university. So that's why the highest chances of migrating in China are at the time that they are entering college, compared to more older people in Portugal and Brazil with the highest chance of migrating. And another interesting thing about China is that most of the parents here are moving without their children, maybe because they are moving from rural to urban areas without the government approval, so they don't take their children, otherwise their children would not have access to education and health services. So they stay behind. So their rates are lower than this group here. Okay. So, and this is just the same kind of exercise for the US, kind of looking at migration rates in the US, data from 2008 and 2009, migration of children really mirroring the migration of parents. So these parents really taking their children, and a little bit in making different exercises, the migration of the full household or just the migration for each one of the individuals. So I reached up to this slide 25 on migration. So the exam on this coming Tuesday will cover the full chapter of fertility, the full chapter of mortality, and covering up to the measures of migration from internal migration chapter, right? So Tuesday we don't meet in the classroom, and actually today here I'm by myself, but on Thursday we will continue on this chapter about internal migration, and then we will talk about, we start talking about migration in the US and some specific other measures of migration in the US. No, wait, I said it wrong. We just covered the first two parts here. So we're gonna cover just in the exam on Tuesday, fertility chapter, mortality chapter, and then in internal migration chapter, only the introduction and conceptual definition. This part here we're gonna see after exam 3. Okay? All good? So thank you very much. And on Tuesday, the exam opens at 1, and I see you again on Thursday. Okay, bye-bye.